Thank you for viewing this video, brought to you by PCE's National Best Practices Committee and sponsored by the Carpel Foundation. The following presentation by Elaine Borakove, President of the Justice Management Institute, explains best practices for studying prosecutor caseloads.
One of the things that I've done in my work, I've done about 50 of these studies, including 16 statewide studies where we've studied a sample of prosecutors' offices within those states. Also done a number of individual offices projecting their resource needs, as well as 3 international studies with a 4th coming up. And one of the things that I think differentiates the work that we started back in the 90s and sort of evolved, and I'll talk about that, is this distinction between caseload and workload. Think about caseload, it's really the volume of cases filed and or disposed. It depends on how you want to count that, whether it's the volume coming in or the volume coming out. But we do that based on an annual basis rather than a weekly, daily, or monthly basis. Part of the reason for doing that is because you get seasonal peaks. You'll have times when you have a much larger volume of cases coming in or going out of the system, and then you'll have times when you don't have as much volume. And so by doing it annually, you're able to kind of even that out, even out those seasonalities, and create a more reliable cases per attorney. But the distinction that I think you really want to focus on is workload, because caseload only accounts for the work that you're doing on actual cases. So one of the things that I like to distinguish is the workload, because with caseload, you're just accounting for the time that you're spending on the actual cases. But workload is those cases plus all the very important things that you, whether it's legal education, serving on task forces, managing your office. These are all really critical functions of an office and really should be taken into account when you're projecting your resource needs. And that's true for managers, supervisors, as well as line attorneys, because they get involved in some administrative tasks, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that may not necessarily be appropriate for attorneys. So if we can go to the next slide. So I was the author of the How Many Cases document that I know you'll hear a little bit more about. And that was really born out of the National Prosecutor Project that was funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And at that time, what did the national ABA has? The ABA standards is that they're not empirically based. It was really just a group of attorneys determining how many cases would be appropriate and didn't take into account a lot of different factors. So when we did our study, we looked at both internal and external factors that could impact the feasibility of national standards. And externally, there were a number, but the most impactful, if you will, were legislative factors. So differences in criminal statutes across states, different criminal justice factors, law enforcement policies with regard from the system, changes in crime patterns, whether it was more violent, less violent crime, as well as population factors, that in and out migration, the age of the population, the composition of the population. But equally important were a number of internal factors. And one that I think we've enough, but is certainly something that we saw in our studies as being creating some of the variation, is this idea of office organization, how you structure your office, whether you use vertical prosecution or horizontal prosecution or some hybrid. And by hybrid, I mean it starts out kind of horizontally and then it gets assigned to a specialized unit to go through the trial preparation, the pretrial stage and trial stage. So that will impact not only the caseload, but the workload, as well as physical resources. Do you have access to support, access to technology? Those are also things that vary from office to office, with larger offices sometimes being more well-resourced than, say, smaller offices in rural communities. Staff skills and experience. The research is very clear. The more experienced attorneys you have, the more efficient you can be. But that's not, where we find ourselves, particularly post-COVID, where we've got a lot of attrition and a lot of the hiring is being done, bringing in new prosecutors, younger prosecutors. And then the last one is really office policies and procedures. What kind of procedures do you have in place for screening, intake, plea negotiations? So all of those things contribute to why we don't have national standards. So I just want to kind of briefly review with you the different kinds of methods that have been used since the 70s with Joan Jacoby. So Joe Jacoby really started by looking at caseload by looking at population and crime trends. The problem with that is that there's a lag time between when population changes, when crime changes, and the impact on the criminal justice system. So it's not as robust a tool for being able to get concerns around staffing. The second method is what I call the parity method. And that's really where counties in particular try to create parity between prosecutors' offices and public defenders' offices, or sometimes between judges, prosecutors, and public defenders. In fact, the very first study that I did in the state of Tennessee was designed to create that kind of parity. The next study is a Delphi study. It is a social science research approach that basically is designed to bring people together, sort of like they did with the ABA standards, to talk about how much time is necessary for cases or how many cases an individual can handle and build consensus around that. It's considered to be very subjective, which then leads us to where we are now and the method that is preferred, and that is a time study because it is much more objective. It really is based on the level of effort associated with cases, not just the volume of cases. And then adding to that, something that we've done in the past decade or so is not just measuring kind of the status quo, which is the criticism of a time study, but also looking at whether or not that time is sufficient. Should you be spending that much time, or do you need more time to actually achieve justice in cases, or do you need someone else to be doing other types of activities so that you can spend more time on cases? So that sufficiency component is really where we get into kind of the quality of justice based on the workload of the office. So I just want to review with you, if you've not been through a time study, what some of the basics are. And it is important to note that you can do these time studies not only with the lawyers in your office, but support staff as well. Because one of the things that you can get when you do that is a ratio of support staff to lawyers. And that's really important because obviously if lawyers are performing more support staff type work, and you're asking for more lawyers based on that, it's more fiscally feasible for counties, I think, to say, oh, we could pay for more support staff so that the lawyers could do the lawyer work. So a timekeeping study basically tracks time by different types of activities. So kind of case preparation, case filing, post-adjudication trial. It allows us to also take into account complexity factors. Not every case is the same. There are a variety of factors that can impact the complexity, whether it's language barriers, whether it's multiple defendants, whether it's competency issues. One study I did, it was one particular defense attorney that everybody said was the complicating factor. So there are a variety of complicating factors that can be tailored to a specific jurisdiction. It does require daily reporting time, which for lawyers I know is lawyers in public service is not ideal because they're not used to keeping kind of billable hours. However, I will say, you know, the perception is that this is a really burdensome process. Over the years, we've actually collected the amount of time it takes people to fill out a timesheet. People who do it throughout the day, sort of on a regular basis, report on average under 15 minutes a day to do the timesheet. People who wait like till the end of the week to do it, one, there's a problem because you're not necessarily remembering what you did earlier in the week, but they report it takes like an hour or more. So, you know, as long as people kind of do it throughout the day, it's really not a burdensome process. And then what you get from that timekeeping is initial calculation of average time by activity and by case. Then we shift into the time sufficiency, where we actually take those average time by activity and we do a survey of the office and we ask them, is this enough time? Is it too much? Is it too little? Is it just right? And if it's too much or too little, we ask them to give us the reasons why, because someone else could be doing it, because of technology challenges, whatever those reasons are. We then can calculate the variance between the average that came out of the timekeeping study and what is reported in the time sufficiency study. This allows us to make time adjustments so that we are projecting resource needs on what is actually needed to do the work properly, not just what is being done right now. What you get from that is time to disposition. For different case types. You get a case weight. In other words, what's the level of effort associated with that case type. You can get a ratio of complex to non-complex cases, which can be really important in making a case to funders. You get what we call a workload measure, which is the measure that we use to project resource needs. In other words, given the level of effort of case-related and non-case related activity, how many cases reasonably can an attorney or support staff member handle? And then you get your resource projections and ratios of lawyers to support staff. So we can go to the next slide. So what do you do with this information? I will say right now, we're not in an environment where data necessarily is the most convincing factor politically. That said, it is really important. So one of the things that I advise people that we work with, offices that we work with, is to look for the motivation of funders. Are they fiscally motivated? Are they motivated based on the impact to the overall system, on public safety, and really then defining your strategies for making your case for resources around that. So if it's fiscal responsibility, part of the argument is that, we can pay for more lawyers to support the status quo, or you could resource us sufficiently with support staff so that our lawyers can actually do the work and reduce their overall workload. You can talk about, and this is something that I was doing here at the Safety and Justice Challenge Conference in Missouri, the impact and the cost of jail population. When people sit in jail pre-trial for months on end, there's a cost to the county for that. And there's a cost to taxpayers. So that's another potentially really salient argument for policymakers. Looking at case backlog coming out of COVID, lots of jurisdictions have huge case backlogs, and judicial resource needs are impacted. So you can make the argument that, by resourcing the prosecutor's office appropriately, you can reduce the burden on the courts and help reduce those backlogs. And then there's just the question of case processing time. The longer it takes to process cases, the more likely witnesses are to disappear, victims are to become reluctant. If an accused individual is out on bond, there's more opportunity for them to potentially engage in more criminal behavior. So there really is an impact to public safety. The longer it takes to process these cases, the more likely that the case is not going to get prosecuted and there's no accountability, or that the person accused of crime has the potential to commit more crime.